Hello, beautiful, and welcome to the podcast where we're moving the conversation forward about the choices you make in your daily life. I'm your host, Monica Cox, and I'm here right alongside of you, learning, growing, observing, and trying to make better choices consciously and subconsciously. Together, we're going to become better versions of ourselves and have raw, honest, open conversations about the things that truly affect our lives. And maybe, just maybe, finally get to a place where everyone else's BS doesn't trigger us. So politics, Bradley. And I think you have I was thinking about this the other day. I think you have a very unique viewpoint on this, in the sense that you grew up in New Zealand and then, this is how I look at it. You were born and raised in New Zealand, but you grew up in the UK. That's how I look at my life. Like we moved there really young in our early 20s, spent over a decade there. And I really feel like that fostered a lot of like who we are as adults. And then you moved to Sweden and you've been there for over a decade now.
Yeah.
And you're interested in this stuff more so than other people. that qualifies you.
That's definitely the disclaimer at the top, is that I am not have any kind of formal education as like a political scientist or anything like that. But yeah, definitely have an interest, I think, in terms of being part of different political and electoral processes and getting a sense of what's not working, I suppose. I think the difficult thing with politics is it's very easy to point holes in it, and that's pretty much what I propose to do for the next period of time on this podcast. But the difficult part is coming up with something else as an alternative, and I think we've gone so far down this democratic route now, and I feel like we've kind of gone away from a lot of the core principles of what democracy was supposed to be about, which was people feeling like they were engaged in politics, their say counted and mattered, and that if there was a move for change, they were able to enact it. Whereas, and that was where the conversation that you had with one of your guests, when you were talking about the US politics and the two-party system that is effectively one-party system, which is big tech or big military industrial complex or big agricultural, whatever you want to call it. And I thought maybe it's interesting to look at a couple of different options, because from someone who sits outside of the US, to put it very bluntly, your system looks so fucked now. When you've got the two people that are running for president, and that's the best two people in a country of, how many are you, like 500 million or something? Like
I think there's like 8 million. Yeah, it's like a lot of people.
It's like how can a 79-year-old, soon to be 80-year-old crook, I think, be the person who's on the right, and someone who literally can hardly talk and walk be the person on the left? Like it just beggars belief when you're from the outside. And I always, that's a question back to you, is like, how disengaged must everyone be when they see that as the two people who are going to lead your country for the next 4 years?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are waking up to the reality of what we got ourselves into as a collective. But what I'm seeing now from more of a kind of like energetic point of view is people just don't believe that it can change. They're like, well, I'm just one person. I can't do anything about it. A third party can't get in. And so they stay there with that mindset. And then that's the reality that's created for the collective, because most of us think that that's just how it is. Where what's happening now with Kennedy, especially, he is like gaining all this momentum, who knows where it's going to go. people are kind of like, oh, maybe there's a possibility, but then they're so scared. They're rooted in the fear because they're still watching the news of like, well, he's a spoiler. He's going to take votes from Biden, or he's going to take, and they're so scared of
Yeah.
the other person getting in. They're not prepared for to just like stand their ground and be like, no. And if enough people show up, Kennedy will get in on default just because most people believe exactly what you just said. The two candidates running are just legit crazy. And if they're not crazy, let's not say they're crazy, they're just old. They need to have a Mai Tai and go to the beach, play golf, like, or get some like medical support because you have Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or like whatever is going on. Like, seek help. Like, don't run the country. So I think that's the big issue in America. It's not that people don't see it now. It's they feel it like a David and Goliath type of thing. And with who's come in, Kennedy, they have done such a good smear campaign on him before he ever even thought about running for president, right? He started tackling and he was suing these big corporations and not going with the narrative, especially with COVID, that they did such a good job to brand him as a tin hat guy that even if people are like, oh, I wish there was someone else, they're like, well, no, he's too conspiracy. And I'm just sitting there going like, fuck it, bring the conspiracy theorist in, because surely he will potentially shake things up, right? Like, I'm not sitting here in delusion thinking like, oh my God, Kennedy's going to save America. But at least there could be some kind of shakeup. But I think that's the thing, is that it's too radical. It's too big of a mind shift for most Americans who have sat in their camps for so long and identify with that, to make a shift. And like you say, most Americans, and I'm not saying I can either, and I don't think you need to have a political science degree to talk about these things, because that's not the majority of people voting. The
No,
majority of
exactly.
people voting are me and you, who
Yeah.
have opinions, but we don't need to have these like this crazy educational background to be like, well, I'm voting for him because he stands, or for her because she stands this way, or even a party, like living in the UK, watching the politics there. And I know it's dramatically changed over the last 20 years. But when I first got there, I was like, there's an election on? What do you mean you're not campaigning for a whole year? Like, this is crazy. Like, you just talk about it for the first 2 weeks and then you vote in the party. You don't vote in a person. And if that person or party isn't standing up to what the collective want, they're out. The person's out and they get someone in, and it's just such a mind-boggling thing, because that's America is just so different to that.
I mean, with all of the systems, that we can cover, there is inherent flaws in all of them, and that's to be expected because nothing is perfect in life, right? I think the thing with RFK, I think the challenging part of your electoral setup is that no one ever gets the chance to prove themselves either, right? Because if you're coming in and you're, say, RFK, and you've got all these ideas, and think about, Bernie Sanders before him, right, who had a little bit of a groundswell of support for a period of time. All of these policies that they put forward, everyone kind of thinks, well, yeah, they're actually just normal ideas, right? Like, they're not actually that radical. Obviously, your media picks it up, and then they've got vested interests based on whatever political leaning, whatever funds them, and whoever pays for their ads and all of that kind of stuff, and then, steers it to a different direction. But the problem with it is you've had independents before, right? Because you had Nader for a while, and I mean, people say they thought he cost Al Gore the election, right, in 2000 with Bush. And the problem is that because they never actually get the chance to govern on like a national stage or actually have some kind of say, everyone becomes unproven, or no one trusts anyone, to your point. And that's where you start getting like some of these random people coming in, or you have dynasties like the Bush or the Clintons, and Obama was so random because it was so left field in the sense of he didn't really have any kind of major political history. I mean, he was an organizer, right, and then he was in the Senate, but not for very long. He wasn't a career politician at that point, and that was a shock. But it feels like since then it's just gone back to the status quo. I mean, when you see the footage of some of those, like Mitch McConnell, when he has these freezers, and then there was the footage of that other senator who was like 80 or 90 or whatever, and the lady's like telling it, no, just say no now.
Yeah.
You wonder, like, if you've got all of these other branches of government, like, what are they doing in terms of coming in to try and influence this national stage? I mean, how many people are in the Senate? How many people are in the House of Representatives? And yet you've got relatively the same kind of people that are constantly put to lead the parties. And I think for me, that then comes back to, and you can start to throw the whole conspiracy thing around, but it's like, where does the true power lie? Because if Biden is in or Trump is in, there are differences. Of course, there's visible differences, but do actually the core things like that matter, let's say, like the economy, social welfare, various other things on a real major scale, do they ever actually change?
Yeah, they don't. And that's the thing. And they're kind of like glossed over. And even Obama, like, was kind of this shiny object. And I really do believe that he kind of came in there with a good heart, but then he definitely had to continue to play the game. And the best thing I can say about that is like Michelle really wanted to push like this like health and wellness for kids, and then it got poo-pooed because the big food agriculture were like, well, that's not what we're saying. We're saying this. And even if you have someone with a good heart, they get corrupt. And my brother's best friend in school wanted to go into politics, and he talked about it all through high school. And he was, the type of guy that could get into it, really chatty, great in front of people, all that kind of stuff. He got into it and it was like, absolutely not, too corrupt. And so that's what I think is happening, is that you get a certain people who go in with a good heart, and you see the corruption, and you either have to play the game and not lose your soul during playing that game, which who knows if that's possible, or you go in and you play the game and you lose your soul, and you just know that it's just so obvious now. I think that's the thing, is I feel like
No.
it's been this way for, probably 50 years, if not more, but it wasn't obvious before. They did a good job at maybe being separate, or I don't even know, because I wasn't really alive or paying attention during the time.
Yeah.
But now it's so obvious. And I think COVID really did a good job to highlight that corruption too. But people, I think that like the kind of ego side of people, or the fear side, if you wake up to that reality, what other realities do you have to wake up to as well? And that's what America faces. It's really not even about like, well, what system do you put in, or like this, how do we get back to what the founding fathers really meant? Any of that. Everyone has to wake up to the fact that they just fucked us over, period. Both sides. And I think that's like really hurtful, and you don't want to do that, especially for the people who trusted them so much. And I think that's like on the Democrat side more so. But that's what I think America has to first wake up to. And then I think people are just maxed out. I mean, I see it everywhere, like in our kids' schooling system, with diet and nutrition, with work, like everyone is so maxed out trying to keep up with the Joneses and be on this certain level, that they have zero time to give two fucks about like the big things in life. And then they have that mindset behind them, like, well, my vote doesn't matter. Like I hear it all the time in Hawaii. They're like, everyone's so Democrat here, they're so Biden. Kennedy will never win the Hawaii. And it's just like, yeah, people are just stuck. They don't want to see it.
But I think that can be convenient for. I mean, yeah, we'll get into talking a little bit about the Swiss model, which I think starts to bring back that idea. It is a semi-direct democracy, but I think part of it is that because of everything you just described, we don't feel almost accountable.
Mm-hmm.
We look at them and say, "What are you doing? Why are you doing that? That's not what we wanted." But we realize that we've voted them in, or if we didn't vote them in, we're complicit in the way that the political system is. So,
Absolutely.
in a sense, so we are able to divorce ourselves from any kind of accountability when it comes to it, which I think is part of, one of the biggest problems. And that kind of trying to drive that accountability back into the individual voters is one of the key steps, I think, to turning things around. But that's a generational change. That doesn't happen overnight. One just quick thing I wanted to pick up on what you talked about in terms of people being disenfranchised. I think part of that comes with this idea of the career politician, and
Mm.
we devolve this idea of, oh well, they've been doing it for so long, then clearly they know what they're doing, and therefore I'll just keep voting them in. And that, to your point around power, and I sent you that image from the artist Jenny Holzer, which was basically this plinth which says the abuse of power comes as no surprise, and that's not a new human condition, right?
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
it's happened to us throughout the ages that at any point we get power, we look at ourselves and think, maybe this could benefit me more than it could benefit other people. But the fact of having career politicians, I think, across all of these political systems that we can touch on, is one of the biggest problems. Because
Absolutely.
you're setting someone up to choose between providing a livelihood for their family and introducing the opportunity to really better themselves and further their financial goals to such a large extent that in some instances, I'm not surprised that people do whatever they can to hold on to that power.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like why, especially if you look at like someone like Nancy Pelosi, why would you want to go back to like the doghouse? Like why would you want to give that up? Um, and I just question what kind of spell people are under, or did life get so hard? Like when we talk about the generations now, we can really like segregate the generations. Did Gen X like have it so hard that they could not get involved what was going on, and so the politicians took advantage of that and were like, well, we'll just put these laws into place where we can forever sit in this seat. We're going to give ourselves a pay raise, every year, like, and that's what happened. Like, because I just don't think no one had enough fucks to give. And
Yeah.
because it doesn't hurt them that bad, I feel like that's what happened in COVID. I'll never forget like sitting with a friend who was like trying to convince me to get a fake vaccine passport because they had a law here in Hawaii where you couldn't enter things without your vaccine card.
Mm.
And she was like, why don't you just get a fake one? I was like, that's not the point. The whole point, and I know I'm not going to change anything being one person, but I got to stand my ground of like,
Mm.
I'm not giving anyone money. Everything runs on money. If everyone just stood up for like what they truly believe, because she didn't believe there should be a vaccine passport, but she was like, well, I just like my life is too rough. I don't have enough energy to worry about
Mm.
that. And so
Mm.
either you get the vaccine for the passport or you get a fake one, right? And then you get to go and continue on living life. And I'm just sitting there going, well, that's how we get into such fucked up situations,
Mm.
because those little things we don't care about, or we don't have enough energy to care about them or stand our ground.
Mm. No, for sure, for sure. But let's maybe touch on some of these different
Yeah.
political setups, and interested in your take on some of them as well. I mean, New Zealand you probably know fairly well, but obviously versus the American system, which is essentially the Democrats versus the Republicans in a presidential runoff, right?
Yeah.
RFK not aside of that, but so in New Zealand they have what's called like an MMP. So that stands for mixed member proportional representation. So basically, at every election cycle, it's every 3 years, so not every 4. And I think the UK is 5 or potentially 5. Every 3 years, you get 2 votes. So you can vote for a party, and then you can vote for a candidate who's based in your geographical location as where you've got it. And obviously there's more like seats in parliament than there are candidates. So if you get voted in as a candidate, then you're a member of parliament. And then based on how that party vote is counted up and the percentage split across all of the parties, then they allocate seats then to some of the other parties. So you could have a minor party in essence that maybe only have 1 or 2 candidates that get voted in, but then they could get, say, 10% of the vote, which means that they would get a greater percentage of these available seats that aren't filled by the candidates themselves. And the idea behind it, in theory, is that it starts to spread the ability, right? It's easy if you've got someone that you see in your geographical location that runs things well, and you want to elect that person to continue to do that job. But you can also choose to vote for, say, an environmental party if you believe strongly in that, and you would like them to have some representation in parliament. So in theory, it sounds like a really good idea. The problem really where it falls down is that one is when there are coalitions, because there often are coalitions now, because no one gets so much of the vote that they can rule by themselves. Again, on the surface, you think, great, it's not one person in charge, able to run it as a dictatorship. There's more people at the table. But the reality is whoever the major party is in that coalition agreement has the majority of the say, right? Mm-hmm. And no surprises that the 2 major parties that have swapped the elections in the last 24 years have been a right party and a left party, right? And that's Labour and National, they call them in New Zealand. So National is the right wing and then Labour is the left wing. The reality of this system, though, I feel, and the problem with it, is part of it is this 3-year term, which is so short that no one ever gets a chance to actually do anything, mm-hmm. right? So again, the idea behind that would be, okay, we're going to keep people to make sure that they're not in too long. Therefore, you know, the voters are always holding them to account. But what actually happens is that these 2 parties end up forming pretty much exactly how the Republican Democrats have, and they have this huge overlapping circle in the center where nothing really changes between them. And they end up having just policies that are on the fringe of each side. And, you know, one is maybe more social welfare, and then the other one maybe is more geared towards the economy. But the reality is that it's not that way. And then the problem with the 3-year term is that if people are getting into power, so for the first time, or they've replaced the previous party, after 1 year, it takes them like a year to figure out what the hell's going on, right? The second year, they might start to decide what exactly they want to do and maybe try to implement stuff. And then in the 3rd year, they're starting to think about campaigning again, right? So they're not going to put anything in that's going to be unpopular that might actually move the country forward, you know, for the betterment of it. So instead they, you know, hold everything and then hope that they get elected again. So you end up having this kind of situation where a lot of things just constantly get canned, because if the parties are changing, they're constantly canning whatever the other party wanted to do. Well, they campaign on the fact that whatever they've just put in was a bad thing. So it's a really interesting way. On the surface, it looks like a positive way. And again, I think the overarching thing, we would say this, you know, there may be a huge amount of first world privilege in this conversation in terms of our political systems, because, you know, we're not living in some of the very difficult parts of the world where none of these are even considerations, right? Like there's a huge abuse of human rights and people's power and so on. But anyway, for the purposes of this conversation, that's the way that it kind of works in New Zealand. And I you know, there's good things. There's limits on campaign funding. There's almost no campaign funding, actually. Everything is very clearly audited. There's no kind of hidden super PACs that are there trying to turn and win elections. But yeah, in reality, nothing that's ever kind of a generational change that will probably help the country never really sticks or never really gets put in if there's a concern and you're always concerned about how am I going to get elected again. And New Zealand has the same problem with a lot of career politicians.
Yeah. I just had to look up because I had this conversation with someone the other day. And exactly to your point, this is what happens in America. You have Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. And we have 4 years, potentially 8. That's the most our president can sit in the seats. But once again, you have 2 of those years of him running for president for the next 4 years, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, but it does swap out, and like you say, there's so much time and effort put into, changing the name on the door and like the letterhead and like all that kind of stuff that things I do feel things get lost. But like, if someone sat for 10 years and they had shitty policies or like they weren't doing great for the country, that just becomes a dictatorship.
For sure. And they would entrench themselves in power even further. I think, yeah, the interesting thing with the terms for me is this idea behind what are we trying to achieve in that period of time. And from my perspective, the idea of voting someone in, or what I mean by what are we trying to achieve as voters, what are we hoping to get out of that, the vote we cast with that party? Now, as you say, in terms of the campaigning, I think all political systems now almost have campaigns the entire time, right? Like everyone's campaigning. We had that recently with Sweden, and I'll come on to that in a second. You use whatever's going bad at the moment to twist that in order to campaign for yourself in some other way, right? Or throw mud at the person who was previously in. But the idea for me, and this is where all of these terms across all of these systems falls down, it makes no sense to me that we elect people on a period of 3, 4, or 5 years based on what they're going to say, and then we have no recourse to what they do in that 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
We have to wait until the next election, right? So they can literally do whatever they want. Now, the reality is do they do that because maybe they don't have the autonomy because of other actors in terms of the economy and all of these other kind of big financial bodies that have a very strong control across our society? But the idea is ludicrous. I mean, think about like if you hired someone. So I hired you for a job, and then I'm like, okay, you've got 4 years and you can do whatever the fuck you want over the next 4 years and I can't fire you.
Yeah.
I mean, it just makes no sense, right? Like,
it honestly feels like living in Hawaii when there's only like one person that does the job, and like this is what we're having with our garage floor. Like he's the only guy that does this one thing that we want, and so it was like, should I contact him again? He hasn't got back to me. He's like, well, he doesn't need customer service because he's the only guy to do it. If you really want it, you're the one who has to like chase him up. Yeah, it's crazy. Sure. It's but what would you do? So does that go to like the British politics where the party is elected, there's a prime minister who's like the head of the party, and I've seen a prime minister several times be kind of booted out and a new one reinstated until that party's time for re-election comes up? Does that work? Does that change anything?
Not really, because like, I mean, the UK system is slightly different to New Zealand. So they're what's called like first past the post. So a little bit more like the US style in the sense of you cast your vote for a person in your geographical location, and whoever gets the most votes win, and then they become the member of parliament for that period of time.
But they also have coalitions though, where that would never happen in America, like ever. So,
and that obviously happens where the vote gets split across. So they do have multiple political parties. The reality, though, even with the possibility of that, there has really only been one major coalition over the last 100 years, which was with the Liberal Democrats when the Conservatives got in the first time. And that was, the Liberal Democrats were probably centre and maybe even more slightly left originally, but then they kind of jumped across to join forces with the Conservatives to govern, basically. And they told themselves, it was interesting because one of our friends, he was one of the aides or assistants to who became the deputy prime minister. And it was really interesting talking to him because he was talking about what the idea around it was, is that they had always been in opposition. They had never been a part of government ever. In, referencing my earlier comment about RFK, they thought, well, if we get a chance to look like we can govern, maybe we'll get more votes. The reality for them was that it was an absolute catastrophe, in that they completely almost got kicked out of parliament entirely for the next election, because they had to contravene all of their core principles in order to go into a coalition. And then none of the things that they wanted to happen in the coalition actually happened because the Conservatives were the major party. So that was a really interesting view in terms of how the UK system was working. But part of what you're talking about around the instability that gets created, that becomes where some of the true power lies in the UK politics, which is nothing to do with the people that actually are in positions of power. A lot of it is the so-called backbenchers that wield a huge amount of power. And particularly in the Conservatives, they have a number of these committees. I forget the exact name of the one, that's 1914 committee or 1942 or something around like a key policy and action within the Conservative Party. But they hold a huge amount of sway, and they often lead no confidence votes towards the Prime Minister if they feel that they're not getting the things that they want. Like, it's got nothing to do with constituents, it's what they want. And that's where you saw a lot of the instability around Brexit. Because there was a lot of different views on how fast and how quick that should be done. And and that's kind of a direct opposite of what I like around the direct democracy, is that there was direct democracy, but with a huge amount of lying going on.
It was insane. And as someone who wasn't able to vote during that, and talking, at the time, we were surrounded by very highly educated public people in the UK, right? And people just didn't go vote. They literally were like, nah, that will never happen. And we're just sitting there going like, what? Like, that's crazy. And then watching the propaganda on it and just no comeback. It was so surreal to watch at the time, and obviously not have like I have to admit it, I didn't have a major investment in it, as just a normal person, I suppose. But at the same time, knowing that, like, you got to show up, and this is just lies. Like, what is going on? And people they didn't have enough fucks to give, Brad.
Yeah. But I think it's your point. It's like having lived their life in a political system where they just casted a vote once every 4 years and then didn't really care until the next 4 years. The whole idea that they had to be proactive and they had to consume information and they had to go looking for the information and not just receive information on the side of a bus that told them how much they were giving away to Europe and that all that money could be spent on the NHS. And ultimately, everything that was said in terms of getting towards a yes vote to Brexit has proved to not be the truth anyway. And you can talk to so many different people across many different industries in the UK, and everyone says that it's fucked and made things so much more difficult. But, to a point, and this is easy for me to say because I don't live there anymore, but, you get what you deserve. If you're not participating and you're not holding yourself accountable for the decisions that are made, and I can guarantee you, if the next referendum came around in 10 years' time around voting yes or no, there would be a lot more people that would vote. Uh,
Yeah.
it-
And did you experience, like, we're not going to call anyone out, but did you experience other Commonwealth people who maybe had never lived in the UK, but were like, yeah, Brexit, I'm so for it, like the British.
well, I mean, this is where, in my personal opinion, like, a lot of Trump's political currency, was garnered from. It's this whole
Yes.
jingoistic thing, right?
All right, guys, we are going to pretend like it's 1992 and we are going to pause this episode. It's to be continued. This is called anticipation. If you have not felt this in a really long time, you're welcome. I think it's a feeling that we all need to bring back into our lives. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. And thank you once again for tuning in and looking forward to continuing this conversation on the next episode. Thank you so much again for joining us here on Choices. You can go ahead and leave a 5-star review because we're all friends here. But if you really want to move the conversation forward, please connect with us on our social media accounts, which you can find the links below. Have a beautiful week, and we'll see you next time here on Choices.